from the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. This is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Nearly 100 days into this second Donald Trump administration, this White House isn't letting off the gas with rolling headlines on tariffs, deportations, student loans, and DOGE. Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel. And this week, we get the view from someone who has been there and done that in the Oval Office and working beside this chief, former Vice President Mike Pence, now the head of the conservative advocacy group Advancing American Freedom. Mr. Vice President, welcome to the show.
Kim Strassel, it's great to be on All Things. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, no, we're very excited to hear your analysis of this because the first Trump term had some really solid achievements, obviously, economically, from a court perspective.
Thank you.
And so I want to get your view on how things are looking in this one, how things are proceeding, because there are some areas where Trump is repeating his policies, but some areas where he's doing things very differently. Just as a starter, if you were to give this administration a grade as we go on to 100 days, and you're allowed to grade it on a curve relative to the first term, what would you give them so far?
I would say well above average, and maybe higher than that based upon the disastrous record of the Biden-Harris administration. As you've noted in your columns, and we've noted at Advancing American Freedom, we've taken issue with what are really departures from what was the Trump-Pence record in our first 4 years. I think the broad-based tariffs are a different tack than the targeted tariffs that we used, notably with China. I would point to TikTok, which our administration unanimously recommended on the CFIUS committee it be banned or sold, and this administration is working to try and find a way to leave what is essentially Chinese spyware active in the country. But beyond all of that, one of the proudest achievements that we had, I thought, was the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. Where we lowered taxes across the board. We set into motion incredible economic growth that resulted in more than 6 million jobs, wages rising at the fastest pace in 10 years, unemployment reaching record levels for African Americans, Hispanic Americans. And about a year ago, after I departed from the presidential campaign, our organization launched a $10 million campaign to support Republicans who want to make all the Trump-Pence tax cuts permanent. And now I think that cause is more urgent than ever, with some rumors coming out of Washington, D.C. that in the wake of the president's broad-based tariffs, which I said a month ago would amount to the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history, and now there's even talk within the hallways of the administration to raising the top marginal rate when they approve an extension of the tax cuts. Of course, that would be a huge tax increase on small business America. It would be anti-growth. And so at Advancing American Freedom, we're trying to make the case for making all the tax cuts permanent, for calling out the tariffs where we think they're going to be harmful to the economy, and also taking a strong stand for the privacy and security of the American people in securing a ban or sale of TikTok.
You have teed up two things I really do want to dig into, tariffs and taxes. Let's start with tariffs.
Sure.
Obviously, as you note, he did use them in his first term, although far more selectively. I remember tariffs on solar panels, washing machines, then more broadly on Chinese imports, tariffs on steel and aluminum from most countries. Obviously, you guys did a rewrite of NAFTA, came up with the USMCA. There were a lot more threats of tariffs than there were tariffs in the end. This time around, he seems to have really embraced it. And while he's paused the retaliatory tariffs for now, there is a growing feeling out there that no matter what trade deals might come out of this, he could stick with that baseline 10% on all imports in this term. Do you think that is going to happen? What do you think of that approach? Where do you think all of this is coming from this time?
Thank you for the history in our administration. I thought you summed it up perfectly. Under our administration, the president made it very clear. I remember during the campaign when he got out of the Asia-Pacific agreement that Hillary Clinton was endorsing, multi-nation agreement, and said the Trans-Pacific Partnership was not in our interest, that what we wanted to do was have arm's length negotiations with individual countries. And we did that. We renegotiated our trade agreement with South Korea. As you mentioned, we passed the largest trade deal in American history with Canada and Mexico in the USMCA. And I can tell you, I was personally involved in preliminary negotiations with the UK, with Japan, and we were even reaching out to the EU. The threat of tariffs during our administration and the heavy tariffs that we rightly put on China were all designed to drive a change in the relationship. And what I've seen in this administration is the rise of more protectionist voices in and around the president, some of whom have even said that tried to tell the American people that tariffs are tax cuts. Tariffs are tax increases, and those tariffs are in the main, I would say, some company that's selling into the United States may, as economists that we work with at Advancing American Freedom tell us, maybe they'll shave a little bit off their price when they face a tariff, but it's the importer in the United States that pays the tariff. And then more often than not passes along that tariff to the consumer. And so we at our foundation, which people can go to at advancingamericanfreedom.com, have been at times almost a singular voice trying to call out these broad-based tariffs for what they are. And while there is this pause in effect, it's important to note that the 10% tariffs across the board on all goods are still in place.
Yes.
And I think the most likely outcome, Kim, and I think you touched on it, is that when all is said and done in working through these so-called reciprocal tariffs unveiled on Liberation Day, that when the dust settles, I think we'll have two things in effect. Number one, I think we'll have very strong tariffs on China. And I would strongly support that. China has engaged in trade abuses, intellectual property theft, leave aside their military provocations in the Asia Pacific. It's time we used access to our economy to get tough on China, just like we did during the Trump-Pence administration. But beyond that, I think what will remain is a 10% across-the-board tariff on all goods, not for negotiations, Kim, but as industrial policy.
Right.
I believe that will be inflationary, that will be harmful to American consumers, it'll be harmful to American growth. And if you combine that with a tax increase on job creators, which is the next topic I know, we could really put at risk the American economy in the short term and the long term.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with former Vice President Mike Pence. Welcome back to All Things with Kim Strassel, here this week with Mike Pence. Yeah, and it strikes me what you say there really is a shift that's happened in the past 8 years, because I remember having a very vivid recollection of Donald Trump. In particular, you mentioned that you went and talked to the UK about a deal. And I remember him exulting in the idea after the United Kingdom went through Brexit, the notion that you could have a free trade deal with the United Kingdom that was truly free, meaning no tariffs, no trade barriers. And that seemed to be his ultimate aim, which was just to dismantle trade barriers. That does seem to have changed now into this belief that tariffs are good in and of themselves, either because of the protectionist nature of them, and just to make sure listeners understand, meaning protecting domestic industries from any kind of competition, or as some method of revenue generation. Would you say that's right?
That's actually 100% right. Look, you can go back decades on YouTube and find that Donald Trump's views at the core of what you just said have really never changed. He has always had the conviction that a certain amount of tariffs insulates the economy and insulates jobs in the economy. And that's not entirely wrong, but at what cost, right? And my judgment is I want to see jobs come back to America. We saw thousands of factories open during our administration, but it was because we cut taxes, rolled back regulation, unleashed American energy, had a strong foundation in the rule of law for which America is known around the world. And businesses came and businesses invested. And so I think you're right. I think in this administration, I think there's a goodly number of officials at very high levels in the White House that are very sympathetic to traditional protectionist economics. It's just, I think at the end of the day, the American people are going to pay the price of that. And I just believe there's a better way to grow this economy without creating permanent barriers. But I think that very much is on the menu. I would tell you, though, Kim, I feel very differently about China, and that was a point I just touched on.
Yeah, talk about that more. I was going to ask you specifically if China isn't a different category.
Look, I have spoken to President Xi one-on-one about trade issues, and we tried to engage China early in our administration. I know the president engaged in an outreach to President Xi and had him at Mar-a-Lago, and he built a good rapport that I believe likely endures to this day. But my sense of China was they were not going to move until we raised the cost. And with the $250 billion in tariffs that we imposed on China, they came to the White House within months. And while people forget it, understandably, in 2020, in January of the year that the COVID pandemic was striking our country, we signed what came to be known as a phase one trade deal with China. Now, the Biden administration didn't enforce it, according to everybody I talked to. But it proved to me that the way you bring China to the table to lower trade barriers and the intellectual property theft, all the other abuses that they've been guilty of, the way you bring them to the table is to create the kind of tariff structure that will cost them access to this economy. And so I strongly support strong measures against China by this administration currently.
Do you worry on that? I mean, I definitely take on board all that point. And I also wonder, is there a level in your mind, and I'm not sure about this myself, is there a level in your mind where they become too high and on China and it causes adverse consequences in terms of a decoupling, too rapid of a decoupling from the United States economy, or causes China to lash out in other ways, let's say militarily in its region and further international turmoil?
Well, on the second point, to borrow a phrase, peace comes through strength.
Yeah.
And I think that we're not talking enough about it, although our foundation has come out strongly in support of Senator Roger Wicker's bill to take defense spending up from 3% of GDP to 5% of GDP. Look, we stay strong in the Asia Pacific. And as you remember, I've got a son in the Marine Corps, a son-in-law in the Navy,
yes,
both of whom have deployed to the region. We stay strong. We'll keep things quiet in the Asia Pacific. That's more about us making sure that our interests and our treaty allies' interests are provided for. But now, that being said, could there be corollary economic effects? I think sure. You've known me a long time, Kim.
Oh, yeah.
I believe trade means jobs. Mm-hmm. What I said back when I was running for president a couple years ago was I believe in get tough on China, but free trade with free nations. We ought to pursue that ideal that I believe the president would love to see, which is no tariffs, no non-tariff barriers between Western nations. And let's all grow together. Let's all prosper together. The American people will win and free nations will win. But I honestly believe that with regard to China, we've got to stand firm. And I think it's actually in the interest of peace in the long term, because China needs to step forward into and respect for the family of nations, if you will, in the West, not trying to supplant the post-World War II order that's existed, but to become a part of it. I think the only way we do that is use the leverage of our economy.
And the one other thing that you mentioned, because I'd just like you to expand on this a little bit more while we're on China, I am also deeply frustrated that we are not using all the levers we have, and that would include backtracking on this TikTok question, especially given this is a duly passed legislation by Congress. Now, I appreciate that even some Republicans seem to be having buyer's remorse once these deadlines came up and became real. But it seems to me that that is a line we need to be standing on.
Well, look, pull back for 1 second, and thanks for your work on this topic. TikTok is digital fentanyl. The TikTok that is available and is subscribed by 150 million Americans, notably young people, is actually banned in China because it's so addictive. But it's utilized here. And it is a platform operated by the Chinese Communist Party, controlled by them. and it compromises the privacy of Americans as they're collecting data, and it compromises our national security. You would never, at the height of the Soviet Union, have allowed the Soviet Union to run the Wall Street Journal or to run
a popular television station.
It's inconceivable, but that's what TikTok is. And when you look at the statistics about how many young people are getting their news from there, it's deeply problematic. A year ago, I'm proud to say our foundation, Advancing American Freedom, ran a television ad campaign in Washington, D.C., focused on members of Congress. And we gave Congressman Mike Gallagher, who led the effort to pass the bill forcing the sale or banning TikTok, we gave him a lot of air cover. Mike told me he was grateful for it. We were proud to be a part of it. At the tail end of our administration, our Intelligence Committee unanimously recommended that TikTok be sold or banned for all the reasons I just told you. It was disappointing to me and actually disconcerting when President Trump as a candidate reversed his position on that. But we weighed in heavily a year ago, and Congress, with a broad bipartisan support, passed a bill that forced the sale or ban of TikTok to January 19th of this year. President Trump extended that, which the law, by one interpretation, did allow him to do if there was essentially a qualified path for the sale of it in place. But I must tell you, the president's additional extension actually is inconsistent with the statute. And we're going to continue to be a voice on behalf of the privacy of the American people and the national security of the United States to call upon the Trump administration, call upon leaders in Congress to step forward and say we have to enforce the law. The TikTok legislation forcing a sale or banning TikTok is the law of the land. And for the sake of the American people, it needs to be enforced.
Well, it's also just part of this message of getting tough on China. And you can't backtrack in some areas because they will take any of that backtracking as an opening and as weakness.
You know, you touched on that, and I should have amplified it because I think at where we are with China right now, sending a message of accommodation of a platform controlled by the Chinese Communist Party in the United States is exactly the wrong message. We ought to be getting tough across the board, increasing military spending and deployments in the Asia Pacific. We ought to be tough on tariffs with China. And for heaven's sakes, we ought to force the sale or ban TikTok outright. Those are the right messages for the American people and for the future. And I will tell you, my own perception of having met President Xi and spoken to him, met with other officials, been at a number of events with Chinese officials is the only thing China understands is strength.
We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more with Mike Pence.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome back to All Things with Kim Strassel. One more topic before I run out of time with you here, and you touched on it. We went through my frustration, obviously, with tariffs is that I really worry that they're going to undercut this president's broader economic agenda, which I would like to see succeed, obviously,
me too,
for many reasons. And in the category of other things that I worry could really derail that effort are, as you mentioned, these whispers, now more than whispers. We are getting these series of stories that are being very strategically placed week after week in leading mainstream newspapers saying that Republicans are debating raising the top marginal tax rate to create a millionaire's tax to levels that were higher even than when Obama was in office, to levels higher than even Kamala Harris was campaigning on. I am told that this is coming from some economic populists within the West Wing, some former aides of J.D. Vance's that are out there because they'd like to see this. They'd like to run on a more economic populist message. And they'd also apparently want to duck the fight with Democrats who claim Republicans are the party of the rich. I can't think of anything that could further undermine a Trump agenda than this. Your thoughts?
I'm very proud of the fact that in 2017, we passed the largest tax cuts and tax reform in American history. We lowered individual rates. We lowered the corporate tax rate, and America boomed. I was so pleased to see from day one of his campaign that President Trump called for an extension of all the tax cut rates. He actually, for a time, was calling for lowering the corporate tax rate to 15%, which we should do, by the way.
Yes.
We got it to 21%. That just got us basically level with the world, but it didn't give us a great advantage. But the word that we're hearing now, and that you've written about so insightfully, Kim, is that the administration is talking about taking that 37% top rate and going not back to 39.6, which it was before we cut it, but all the way to 40% on so-called millionaires. But here's the hard fact of this, and I will say to you emphatically, other than national defense, there should be no higher priority for the Congress and this administration to make the Trump-Pence tax cuts permanent.
Thank you.
To do less than that, I think to talk about raising marginal rates, even at the top level, is bad policy and bad politics. On the bad policy front, look, I said in a tweet a week ago, Republicans don't raise taxes, Republicans cut taxes.
Yep.
But the other piece I think is so important that I know you get is that while this may be driven by some of the populist voices in and around the president right now, and this tension within the party between those of us that are traditional free market conservatives, believe in limited government, and some of the new populist right that's out there, is what they will call a millionaire tax would be an enormous tax increase on small businesses in this country.
Excellent point.
I pulled the stat for you. More than 50% of small businesses in this country report income of more than $1 million, because that's what your listeners will understand well, that most small businesses are organized as a pass-through, a subchapter S corporation. And if you raise the top marginal rate, you are essentially taxing the income of that business that's being reported to that individual. That's income that I grew up in a small business family. We ran gas stations in southern Indiana. I know the way it works. You report as an individual, and then the owner of the company plows a lion's share of that back into payroll, into property, plant, equipment, into growing the business, creating jobs. The fight that we announced a year ago at Advancing American Freedom, a $10 million campaign, we invested about half of that in the election year itself to make permanent all of the Trump-Pence tax cuts. But we are absolutely committed to arming pro-growth Republicans in the House and the Senate with the facts about this and making it clear that to raise taxes on job creators would work against restoring the economy in the ways that we were able to do during the Trump-Pence years. So it's bad policy. One last thing, if I can.
Yeah.
It's also bad politics. And I can speak from experience on this, Kim. People who know my story, and I don't expect many do, wouldn't know. Before I was elected in the year 2000, I ran twice in 1988 when Ronald Reagan was still in the White House, and I was on the ballot as a candidate for Congress in 1990 when President George Herbert Walker Bush, God rest his soul, broke his promise to not raise taxes and passed a budget deal that increased taxes. And it was bad policy, but it was devastating politics. Republicans got wrecked in 1990. It dislocated an administration that prior to that, if you remember, in the first Persian Gulf War, President Bush had an approval rating that had skyrocketed, but the party experienced a massive defeat in 1990. But our first argument is that it's bad policy, and it's going to work against jobs and work against growth of the American people. So the answer is make all the Trump-Pence tax cuts permanent, and the way you pay for that is not by raising taxes on job creators. The way you pay for that is by rolling your sleeves up and really bringing the kind of spending cuts and reforms necessary to grow the economy.
Well, and I will add this too. This president in particular, I think, is admired by many of his voters and was put into office precisely because they believe that he will do what he said he was going to do.
Sure.
And he's on record many, many times last election season saying nobody would see their taxes being raised. So I think it's unfortunate those around him who are working to try to get him to break his own campaign promise.
Kim, I will tell you, it would surprise people to know the president and I had a great relationship for 4.5 years.
Sure.
Didn't end the way I wanted it to, but I'm incredibly proud of that record and the way we worked together. I will tell you, I lost count of the number of conversations that ended in the Oval Office or ended in the cabinet room when somebody, sometimes me, would remind the president that that's what he said he was going to do in the campaign. Mm-hmm. And he would almost invariably stop and say, oh, well, that's right. And for our part, we're going to try and be a positive, constructive voice, not just for members of Congress, but for the president himself and in the administration. This is what we did before. This is what he told the American people he was going to do. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a fighting chance to push back against some of those economic populists that would seek to raise taxes to try and create the Republican Party in their image.
Well, that's a really fascinating, if not surprising, insight. I'm glad you told us about that. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show this week. We also want to thank our listeners. We are here every week. If you like the show, you can hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at atkim@wsj.com.